Now let's cover some introductory material here on the book of Judges. And we're just going to cover the first part here in Judges chapter 1 through Judges chapter 3, verse 6. Now the judges of Israel were God's chosen representatives to arbitrate legal matters among his people. We think of the judge in that way. But they were also given the responsibility to administer social affairs and to lead in military campaigns against Israel's enemies. So they were responsible for judicial matters, but they were also to administer social affairs, and you see them functioning as military leaders, again leading campaigns against Israel's enemies. And God himself was the supreme judge of the judges of Israel. Now, with regard to authorship and date, it's likely that the book of Judges was written during the reign of Saul, Israel's first king. And remember that in the future, when Israel does begin to have human kings, that there are going to be 3 kings who are going to serve under what is called the United Kingdom. And that is going to be Saul, David, and Solomon. And after the death of Solomon, Rehoboam comes in and the kingdom is split at that point. And so you're going to have the 10 tribes in the north and the 2 tribes in the south. So you're going to have the kingdom split. But again, it's likely that the book of Judges was written during the reign of Saul, Israel's first king. And there are several references in the book of Judges which state in those days there was no king in Israel. You see it several times where it says in those days there was no king in Israel. Now this is a literary marker here where one can look at this and say, well, this was written by a future generation looking back on the period of the judges. And one of the things that made it stand out was that in those days there was no king in Israel. Now you also find the twice repeated phrase that every man did what was right in his own eyes. You see it again in chapter 21, verse 25. But here in Judges 17:6, it says again, in those days there was no king in Israel. You see it again in Judges 18:1, in those days there was no king in Israel. Judges 19:1, when there was no king in Israel. And then Judges 21:25, the last verse, in those days there was no king in Israel. And then you have that statement again where it says that everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So this seems to imply that at the time of the writing there was a king in Israel at the time when the writing took place. Though he's never mentioned within the book, Samuel the prophet is regarded as the author of the book of Judges. Now one can't be dogmatic here, but that seems to be the case. If Samuel is accepted as the author, then this would place the writing sometime around 1040 BC. 1040 BC. Now the period of the Judges is going to run roughly about 340, 350 years. So the chronology of Judges. Now the book of Judges records the period of time between the end of the leadership of Joshua and the appointment of Saul as Israel's first king. And that was going to put it roughly about 1390 to 1350 BC down to the time of 1050 BC. So it's going to be roughly 300 to 340 years time frame. Now, some judges served consecutively and others ruled concurrently. And the people of Israel rejected God as their king and the judges that he'd appointed over them, and they requested a human king. So this is what's going to happen later. Remember in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7, where the people had come to Samuel and said, hey, we want a king so that we can be like the other nations. Well, having a king was part of God's intended plan for Israel's history, but not that they would be like the other nations. But remember that we had talked about it before, that God himself was Israel's king. He was their lawgiver and he was their judge. And so in 1 Samuel 8:7 it says, Then the Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, But notice they have rejected me from being king over them. And then in 1 Samuel 12:12 it says, when you saw that Nahash, the king of the sons of Ammon, came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us, although the Lord your God was your king. So again, the people of Israel rejected God as their king and the judges that he'd appointed over them when they requested a human king. Now the period of the judges ends when Samuel appoints Saul as the first king of Israel. That's when the period of the judges will formally come to an end, because at that point there's now a king in Israel and now it's a different rulership status. Now the function of the judges. The term Shaphat, and when you look at it in the plural in the book of Judges, it's Shophatim for plural. The term judge, Shaphat, means judge or deliverer. It means judge or deliverer. And it's going to refer to God's judicial and military leader who protected Israel from enemies. Again, God's judicial and military leader who protected Israel from enemies. Lindsay, and here I'm quoting from the Bible Knowledge Commentary, F. Duane Lindsay did the section on Judges. So I'm quoting from him here. He says, it was a general term for leadership combining the executive, that is, including military, and judicial aspects of governing. He goes on, he says, thus the judges of Israel were primarily military and civil leaders with strictly judicial functions included as appropriate, end quote. And so they did function in judicial capacities, but when we think of the term judges, we shouldn't think of them primarily as sitting on benches. We should think of them primarily as military and civil leaders. That was primarily how they functioned. So again, his comment here that the judges of Israel were primarily military and civil leaders with strictly judicial functions included as appropriate. And we think of the example that he gives here in Judges 4:5, where it says, she, this would be Deborah, used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. And so they did function in that capacity. Now we do want to point out, and this will become glaringly obvious as we move through the book of Judges, and that is that the judges themselves were sinful men. Ecclesiastes 7:20 says, there is not a righteous man on the earth who continually does good and who never sins. Again, Ecclesiastes 7:20 says, there is not a righteous man. We're not talking about a sinner here. We're talking about a righteous man. He says, indeed, there is not a righteous man on the earth who continually does good and who never sins. And the judges, and we're going to see some of these people. We're going to see Gideon. We're going to see Samson, men who are listed in Hebrews 11 in the Hall of Faith. These are believers. They're in heaven today. But these are leaders with some problems. Gideon had a problem with idolatry. He did so well, but then by the end of his life, he creates an ephod of gold and it becomes an object of worship in his town. We know that we know that Samson had a problem with the ladies and other issues. He broke his Nazirite vow. But Samson had some problems. And yet they were faithful to the thing to which the Lord called them. They were not perfect. And so we want to point out, and we'll see this throughout, that the judges themselves were sinful men who had their own failings. Yet their faith in God makes them usable to the Lord to accomplish His will. Again, their faith in God makes them usable to the Lord to accomplish His will. And when the Lord called them to a specific task, they obeyed. Now that doesn't mean that they were perfect in all areas of their life. They were not, and no one is. But they were faithful to the thing to which the Lord called them. And Judges demonstrates Israel's repeated failure to follow God as king. It demonstrates Israel's repeated failure to follow God as king. And you'll see this throughout. In fact, there's a particular pattern that you see throughout the book of Judges. Now, the nation repeatedly allowed itself to be influenced by the surrounding culture and turned away from God and worshipped idols. And you see a pattern throughout, and this pattern has been noted by scholars. And I remember teaching through the book of Judges some years ago. We went through Judges and Ruth, and it was a very, very fascinating study. But when we went through it, we looked at 6 patterns that occur. Now, some say that there's 7. I think that there's clearly defined 6 occurrences of this. But the pattern that you see throughout the book of Judges follows this general pattern here. It is one of sin, slavery, or we might say suffering, supplication, and salvation. So we could call it sin, that is, Israel turns away from the Lord and worships idols. So they fall into a sinful pattern. God sends discipline that results in their slavery. We could say God sends suffering if you want to keep the S pattern going. While they are in a state of suffering or oppression, Israel cries out to the Lord from their oppression. This would be their supplication. And then fourthly, God raises up a judge to rescue them. This is their salvation. And I put together this little visual here a few years back, and so I pulled it from some of my older notes. But again, you're going to see this cycle of behavior, and you're going to see it repeated 6 times throughout the book of Judges. And what you're going to notice also in the pattern is that Israel progressively gets worse. So in the cycle of pattern here, it's a progression towards greater and greater evil, turning away from the Lord. I mean, just by the time we get to the end of Judges, you're going to see there's some pretty evil stuff going on. It's pretty horrendous. And so again, you're going to see the pattern here where you're going to see the people sin against God. They're going to turn away from the Lord. They're going to turn to evil. In fact, we're going to look throughout the book of Judges, and we're going to see the repeated phrase of evil. But it's interesting because in the Hebrew, it's the Hebrew ha-ra. And ra is the word for evil, but the pattern you see throughout the book of Judges is it's going to talk about the evil. Ha-ra, the definite article precedes ra. And so it's talking about a specific kind of evil, and most notably idolatry. Idolatry is going to be the big sin. And so Israel is going to sin against God. God, being faithful to his covenant promise, per Deuteronomy 28, is going to send discipline upon his people. There's going to be suffering that is going to come from God. God is going to be absolutely faithful to his word. Then the people in their state of suffering are going to cry out to the Lord. There's going to be supplication to God. They're going to cry out to him, God, help me. God, save us. Rescue us from this evil oppression. And because God delights in mercy, because he is so quick to forgive, he is going to raise up for them a deliverer, a judge. And the judges are those people whom God raises up to function as Israel's deliverers. Again, these are not perfect people. They've got their problems. But when God calls them, they respond in faith and obedience to that thing to which the Lord calls them. And so they wind up being examples of faith. The writer of Hebrews is going to draw from the book of Judges and pull in some of these examples. And we're going to see Samson mentioned. We're going to see Gideon mentioned. These people that are brought in. So these are believers. And God is going to raise up the judges who are going to provide salvation. But again, the pattern here, the cycle that you'll see throughout the book of Judges. Now, in one sense, you can almost take this as a paradigm over individuals, because you could really see this pattern in the lives of God's people, where you will see God's people sin against the Lord. And Hebrews 12:6 says, he whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, like a father his own son. 1 Corinthians 11:30 through 32 talks about stages of divine discipline. And so God begins to discipline his people. And then you see people, when they're in that state, will then cry out to the Lord in supplication, and God will rescue them. I saw this in my own life for years when I was living in Vegas back in the 80s, where I had turned away from the Lord and I was living a life of petty crime and a lot of drug abuse. And I found myself in and out of juvenile hall half a dozen times and in and out of the Clark County Jail half a dozen times. And even during those occasions, I would cry out to the Lord. And the Lord would rescue me. He would pull me out. And then, dumb as a box of rocks, Steve would go right back to my sinful behavior. Until eventually, God broke me fully. And I needed that discipline. I needed it to go to that point. It was like Nebuchadnezzar's 7 years in the wilderness, where at the end of it, he said that God is able to humble those who walk in pride. Or Jonah's 3 days in the belly of the fish. That was enough to humble the prophet, to make him obedient to the word. And so God does it. So you can see this pattern here in the nation of Israel, but you can really even see this as a paradigm for individuals with regard to how we turn away from the Lord. God can discipline us. We can cry out to the Lord, and then He can rescue us. But you'll see this pattern throughout. It's tremendously helpful to understand. So going back to the notes here, now the above pattern is repeated 6 times throughout the book of Judges. And Israel's spiritual condition, either in obedience or disobedience, determined their political and physical success or failure. Again, I reference Deuteronomy 28 there, parenthetically, because remember, we had spent almost an hour going through Deuteronomy. And I was driving the point when we went through Deuteronomy to say that Israel here has entered into a bilateral covenant relationship with God. Remember that the other covenants, whether you're talking about the Noahic covenant or the Abrahamic covenant or the Davidic covenant or the New Covenant, those are unilateral covenants in which God promises to execute His promise. But the Mosaic covenant was a bilateral covenant where there were blessings and cursings that were conditioned on obedience or disobedience. So Israel's spiritual condition, again, either obedience or disobedience, determined their political and physical success or failure. So you can see this throughout. God is being faithful as the covenant-keeping God. So not only did Israel fail to obey God and to drive out the Canaanites, but they even befriended them, intermarrying with them, and adopting their culture, and eventually worshiping their gods. And it's just absolutely horrendous what goes on in Israel during this time. When Israel was faithful to the Lord, God strengthened them to defeat their enemies. But when Israel was disobedient, God strengthened their enemies. We're going to see where God is going to raise up some of these people to serve as disciplinary agents against His people, much like He did in 722 BC when He raised up the Assyrians to defeat the 10 northern tribes. Because remember, when the tribes had broken away, the 10 northern tribes were under the leadership of Jeroboam. And when you read about the 10 northern tribes of Israel, after the death of Solomon and the kingdom was split, they followed in what was called the sins of Jeroboam. The sins of Jeroboam. And you see this throughout the 10 northern tribes' history. And Jeroboam had set up these worship centers in Dan and Bethel where they worshiped these golden calves. But it was an attempt to keep the people from going down into Jerusalem to worship at the temple. But that idolatry continued, and God eventually raised up the Assyrians in 722 BC to function as His disciplinary agent against the Assyrians to destroy them. Then God raised up Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians to defeat Judah in the south, because even though Judah had some good kings, and they in effect delayed the judgment of God, eventually they crossed a line, a point of no return. And so remember that in Jeremiah 25, God refers to Nebuchadnezzar as my servant, because God is using Nebuchadnezzar to execute the judgments that He had promised back in Deuteronomy 28. So again, when Israel was faithful to the Lord, God strengthened them to defeat their enemies, but when Israel was disobedient, God strengthened their enemies. And it also demonstrates the principle that the faith of one generation did not guarantee the faith of the next. So a legacy could not be guaranteed. Moses had done a wonderful job in leading Israel and giving them everything they needed for a life of success, and he repeatedly told them over and over again, obey the Lord, be obedient to the word, and follow his commands so that you will be successful. And Moses wanted their success. Joshua the same way. He followed in the steps of Moses. And he told them, look, follow the Lord, obey his commands. Remember the commandments of Moses, to obey them, because Joshua too wanted them to be successful. And that generation that was under Joshua was by and large successful, with some failings. But nonetheless, it demonstrates the point that the faith of one generation did not guarantee the faith of the next. So a legacy could not be guaranteed. Now, as Christians, and even as Christian leaders, we are responsible for output but not outcomes. We are responsible for output but not outcomes. We can't control how people respond to what we communicate or how we live. And our lives should be an example. It should be a conduit of light and truth and love and grace to a fallen world that needs God. And we can communicate that. But even though we are responsible for output, to be obedient to the word believers, it's no guarantee that people will respond positively to that. And even if you have one generation that responds favorably to the Lord by and large, it's not a guarantee that the next generation will follow in the faith of their parents. Now, this period was marked by general rebellion, in which, again, every man did what was right in his own eyes. That Judges 17:6 and Judges 21:25, that the author of Judges puts that statement in there, where it says that every man did what was right in his own eyes. So this means that they failed to walk in obedience with the Lord. So Israel's failure to take the land of Canaan resulted in long-term problems for many years, for centuries, as a matter of fact. Going back to our previous comment here, that the period was marked by general rebellion in which every man did what was right in his own eyes. That's, again, going to be one of the hallmark characteristics of the book of Judges. Now, when we start into Judges chapter 1, it starts off, it says, "Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" So we have this this inquiry is basically who's going to take the lead. And it's talking about which of the tribes here. Now the Lord himself replied and said, "The Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand." Then Judah said to Simeon his brother, "Come up with me into the territory allotted to me." Now I'm going to go back over here to the map for just a second and show. Remember the breakdown of the tribes here. You have Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben that are going to be east of the Jordan River. And then within the land of Canaan, you have Asher and Naphtali to the north, Zebulun, Issachar, Manasseh moving down towards the central. Then you have Ephraim, Dan, Benjamin. But then when you get down into Judah proper, remember that Simeon had land, the tribe of Simeon had land within the boundaries of Judah. So this makes sense here when the Lord said that Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. But then Judah appeals to Simeon, his brother, and says, "Come up with me into the territory allotted me, that we may fight against the Canaanites." So again, this makes sense when you understand how the tribes are in relation to each other, and that the tribe of Simeon had land within the larger region of Judah. I've got a note here. Let me chase this down. I was putting together some thoughts earlier. Now, Judges 1:4 in particular, it says that Judah went up and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. That's interesting here, because if you go back, you have the directive given in Judges chapter 1 verse 2 that the Lord said, Judah shall go up. So those are the marching orders. Those are the directives from God to Judah, that Judah shall go up. That's what they were told to do. And so then Judah consults with Simeon, and says, hey, let's do this thing together. I'm paraphrasing here, obviously. But they say in verse 3, come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we, that is Judah and Simeon, may fight against the Canaanites, and I in turn will go with you into the territory allotted to you. So Simeon went with him. But in verse 4, we have the faith response. It says, Judah went up. That is an act of obedience. That is a faith response to the Lord, who is directing Judah to take the lead here. So it says in Judges 1:4, so Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. So again, Judges 1:4 shows that Judah and Simeon were functioning under divine viewpoint. That the Lord issued the order and they executed it. They had a responsibility, and that's what the walk of faith is. The walk of faith is when the Lord gives a directive and we salute and say, yes, sir, and we execute His command. So the Lord here issued the order and they executed it. Now, as they advanced in God's directive will, and this is part of His directive will, that the Lord provided the victory because blessing tracks faith rather than human strength. So their success illustrates the principle that when believers operate inside the will of God, that He supplies the power and He produces the results. Now the same pattern appears throughout the New Testament, where believers are called to walk by faith and not by sight, that we are to follow the Lord's directives when He gives a directive. And of course, as Christians, we are told, 2 Corinthians 5:7, for we walk by faith and not by sight. That is, we trust in divine revelation, not empirical data. Now, we don't dismiss empirical data, but when God gives a directive where divine revelation speaks, empirical functioning must give way to that. Remember that when you're studying the Word of God, you're studying divine revelation. And the Word of God, and really theology as a whole, good Christian theology, serves as the queen of sciences. And so it serves as the anchor, as the reference point, because you're talking about things that are given to us by means of divine revelation. And so we are told here to walk by faith and not by sight. Hebrews 10:38, God says, but my righteous one shall live by faith. Now this is phase 2 of the Christian life. This is the believer who operates in the walk of faith. Hebrews 11:6 says, and without faith it is impossible to please Him. For he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who seek Him. So we see here Judah and Simeon being obedient to the Lord. Ephesians 6:10 tells us to be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. And Philippians 2:13 tells us to trust that it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for His good pleasure. So again, we see here where they are being obedient to the Lord. They are obeying His directive. And so they go up, and as they walk in faithful obedience, the Lord gives them the victory. So the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. So this section here introduces the historical and theological crisis that unfolds after the death of Joshua. While the book of Joshua ends on a high note of conquest and covenant fidelity, Judges opens, and we're going to see here very quickly, with fragmentation, compromise, and spiritual decline. But we do have these moments of success. So we're going to see the fragmentation, we're going to see the compromise, we're going to see the spiritual decline, but this is going to happen as we move on. So these early chapters form the prologue to the book and explain how Israel devolved into chaotic cycle of sin, oppression, supplication, and deliverance, and a time of peace that characterizes the period of the Judges. I've got a quote here by Chisholm, and this is taken from the commentary on Judges and Ruth that he did. And he says, quote, Judges tells us how the covenant community disintegrated morally and socially as it assimilated Canaanite culture and beliefs. And God both punished and delivered wayward Israel, but the downward spiral continued. So even though we have this act of faith from Judah and Simeon, there's going to be this downward spiral, and that's what he talks about here. That God both punished and delivered wayward Israel, but the downward spiral continued. He goes on, he says, the need for competent godly leadership becomes apparent, paving the way for the next part of the story recorded in Samuel and Kings, end quote. So theologically, Judges 1:1 through 3:6 reveals the failure of the new generation to drive out the remaining Canaanites, their accommodation to pagan culture, and the beginning of covenantal disobedience that would provoke God's discipline. The land had been given, but Israel failed to take full possession by faith and obedience. So these chapters, from the introduction here, I'm talking in an overview way, set the tone for the entire book when God's people forget His word and tolerate compromise, spiritual and national collapse follows. So Judges 1 recounts Israel's military victory after Joshua's death. We just saw that with Judah and Simeon. The Lord had commanded complete conquest, but the chapter records a mixture of initial success, which we see here with Judah and Simeon, but then eventual failure. So Judah, with divine assistance, defeats several Canaanite cities. And it's interesting because what it talks about in verse 4, how they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. It says they found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek and fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and Perizzites. And they said, but Adoni-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Now, interestingly enough, Adoni-Bezek, the king, said 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to gather up scraps under my table. And then here's a guy who recognizes divine justice. He says, as I have done, so God has repaid me. So he realizes that he has done bad because he recalls when he had, in effect, captured 70 kings and he had cut off their thumbs and big toes, which would disable them. And he talks about how they used to gather up scraps under my table. But then he says, as I have done, basically to them, so God has repaid me. So recognizing divine justice here. Not that this man turned to faith or anything, but nonetheless his conscience recognizes that justice has been executed. We're then told in verse 8, then the sons of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. Now later Jerusalem is going to become the capital of Israel, the center where the temple is going to build. David's going to set it up that way. But at this point, Jerusalem was under pagan control. It was just one of the many cities that were being conquered. And then verse 9 says, afterwards the sons of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites living in the hill country and in the Negev and in the lowland. So Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. It says, now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arva, and they struck Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. Then from there he went against the inhabitants of Debir. Now the name of Debir formerly was Kiriath Sefer. Now these sort of parenthetical comments here would again lead us to think that this was written sometime later, and he's referring back and he's giving their former names. And Caleb said, the one who attacks Kiriath Sefer and captures it, I will give him my daughter Aksa for a wife. And then we have this man named Othniel who steps up. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, so he gave him his daughter Aksa for a wife. And so we have this encounter here where they're moving into the land, they're capturing it. And we see this early on, what appears to be good, but then we'll see the decline shortly. Verse 14, then it came about when she came to him that she persuaded him to ask her father for a field. Then she alighted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you want? And she said to him, give me a blessing. Since you have given me the land of the Negev, give me also springs of water. So Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. And then it tells us that the descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the sons of Judah to the wilderness of Judah, which is in the south of Arad, and they went up and lived with the people. Then Judah with Simeon his brother, and they struck the Canaanites living in Zephath and utterly destroyed it, so the name of the city was called Hormah. And Judah took Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. And notice here again, verse 19, that the Lord was with Judah. And they took possession of all the hill country. But then we're told, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. Now, that's a very interesting statement. Iron chariots were kind of the tanks of the day. I think that this is a failure on their part because chariots are no match for the Lord. But it tells us here that they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. Then they gave Hebron to Caleb as Moses had promised, and he drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak. So Judah, with divine assistance, defeats several Canaanite cities, but the remaining tribes failed to drive out the inhabitants of their territories. And you find this throughout, where it says, but the sons of Benjamin, verse 21, did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem. And notice the clause here, to this day. Again, this is talking about a future time. So it's giving the historical reference point that tells the history behind the time in which the author is writing. Verse 21, likewise the house of Joseph went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. The house of Joseph spied out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. Again, another parenthetical explanation. The spies saw a man coming out of the field, and they said to him, please show us the entrance to the city, and we will treat you kindly. So he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go free. The man went into the land of the Hittites and built a city and named it Luz, which is its name, again, the clause to this day. Verse 27 tells us, but Manasseh did not take possession of Bethshean and its villages. And again, you're going to find these references where you're going to find these places that are not conquered, not conquered. And then down in the latter part of that verse, it says, so the Canaanite persisted in living in the land. Verse 28, it came about when Israel became strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor. So rather than driving them out, they decide they're going to put them to forced labor. And then we have the latter part of verse 28, but they did not drive them out completely. So again, we see this early failure. Ephraim, we're told in verse 29, did not drive out the Canaanites. So whereas Judah and Simeon start out very well, the other tribes are breaking down. So again, verse 29, Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer. So the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Verse 30, Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalal. So the Canaanites lived among them, and again, rather than drive them out, that they became subject to forced labor. This is not under divine direction, by the way. Verse 31 tells us Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko. Again, disobedience. Or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Alam, or of Akzib, or of Helba, or of Aphik, or of Rehob. So, we're told the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, and then we're told in verse 32, again, they did not drive them out. So we're seeing this repeated statement. Verse 33, Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, and the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath. Again, for the third time here, we have a reference to they became forced labor among them. Verse 34, then the Amorites forced the sons of Dan. Now we have a turn. They forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the valley. Yet the Amorites persisted in living in Mount Heres, in Aijalon, and in Shalbim. But when the power of the house of Joseph grew strong, they became again forced labor. So again, we see this repetition here. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Achrabim, from Selah and upward. So again, instead of destroying the pagan nations as commanded, Israel allows them to remain, often subjecting them to forced labor. And you see the references to forced labor there in verse 28, verse 30, verse 33, and then again down in verse 35. But they were supposed to drive them out. In fact, remember back when we were going through Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1, it says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, and clears away many nations before you, because the Lord was leading them to drive out these nations. Again, he names the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God delivers them before you and you defeat them, then you shall utterly destroy them. We're told here, he says, you shall make no covenant with them and show no favor to them. Well, the Israelites were failing. They were failing to drive them out. And rather than drive them out, they were allowing them to remain in the land, and they were even subjecting them to forced labor. That's not the directive. So we see here very early on disobedience. Again, Judah and Simeon started out well. We salute them, we say good job. But then the other tribes begin to break down. Verse 3 tells us in Deuteronomy 7:3, furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons. Why? Verse 4, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. And we're going to see that's exactly what's going to happen in Judges. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. But you shall do to them, but thus you shall do to them. You shall tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars, and hew down their Asherim and burn their graven images with fire. And the reason is God wanted them to be holy and set apart. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. So those are the directives. And we see here where we have a standard that is set forth by God, but the Israelites are being disobedient. I've got a side note here that I put together. That Scripture portrays the Canaanite culture as morally collapsed and spiritually militant against the Lord. This is a hostile culture. Not all cultures are good. Definitely not all cultures are evil. Some cultures are absolutely evil and corrupt to the core. And the Canaanite culture was one of those kind of cultures. Their religious system included idolatry and occult practices. Remember Deuteronomy 18, verses 9 through 12, it says, when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations. And that's what's going to happen with Israel. They're going to learn the detestable things of those nations. Verse 10, there shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire. That's human sacrifice, because they were sacrificing their own children. Their own children. They were burning them alive. Not only that, but they were involved in all sorts of occult practices. One who uses divination, one who practices witchcraft, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who casts a spell, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead, necromancy. God says, verse 12, for whoever does these things is detestable to the Lord, and because of these detestable things, the Lord your God will drive them out before you. Again, he's driving them out of the land. So they practiced idolatry and occult practices. They had ritual prostitution and sexual perversion, such as homosexuality and even bestiality, that is, sex with animals. Leviticus 18:22 and 23 says, "You shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination." Verse 23, "And you shall not have intercourse with any animal to be defiled by it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion." And believe it or not, these sorts of things go on today. These sorts of evil practices are still alive in the world. Tremendously evil. But these are some of the things that the Canaanites were practicing. Even child sacrifice to the god Molech. Again, as their children were burned alive. Leviticus 18:21, "You shall not give any of your offspring to offer them to Molech." Jeremiah 7:31 describes this. It talks about how they have built, and this is centuries later, he says they have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire. And again, every time I read this, it grieves me and it angers me to think about the evil that was done to these children, these infants, because they adopted the practices of the culture around them. Their violence, injustice, and predatory lifestyle had reached a point where God had declared where the iniquity of the Amorite previously it was not yet complete, yet by the time of Joshua's era it was full. Against this backdrop, Israel's mandate was to drive out the Canaanites, not eliminate them as an ethnic group. This was not ethnic cleansing. You'll hear sometimes people say, "Oh, the Israelites went and it was ethnic cleansing." No, it wasn't. The mandate was to drive out the Canaanites, not to eliminate them as an ethnic group. The Lord repeatedly said he would drive out the nations, that he will drive out the Hittites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites before you, and that they would be dispossessed, that the Israelites were to dispossess them so that their idolatry would no longer corrupt the land. Numbers 35:52, "You shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you. Those who resisted were killed in battle, but those who turned to the Lord were spared and welcomed," such as Rahab and, of course, later Ruth. The focus is the removal of a deeply corrupt religious culture, not genocide, and mercy was extended to anyone who aligned themselves with the God of Israel. So again, they were to drive them out, but here we see the repeated failure of the Israelites. So the result is incomplete obedience, a theme that will have dire consequences. Again, you see the phrase repeated throughout that they did not drive them out. It's a repeated theological indictment in the book of Judges showing Israel's disobedience to God's command. What began as partial conquest turns into dangerous compromise. Dangerous compromise. Now, we saw the early signs of this back even under the leadership of Joshua. Remember the account at Ai, remember in Joshua 9 where they had entered into a covenant with the Gibeonites. They had not sought the counsel of the Lord, and that was wrong for them to do that. They should not have done that. And then we see towards the end of Joshua where they were not taking the land. They were not driving out the people. Well, what started out in small form there, here grows and grows and grows. So again, the phrase that they did not drive them out is a repeated theological indictment in Judges showing Israel's disobedience to God's command. So again, what began as partial conquest turns into dangerous compromise, undermining Israel's spiritual identity and mission. Now, chapter 2 opens with a visit from the angel of the Lord. This is going to be a theophany. A theophany is an Old Testament appearance of God. And the language is very straightforward. Joshua 2:1 says, "Now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt." This is God. "I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you." So God is faithful. He's always faithful. In fact, God cannot lie. Verse 2, and as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. Again, the directive is constantly to do the Lord's will. He says, you shall tear down their altars. But then we have here this clause. So the directive was that they were to go in. They were not to make any covenant with the inhabitants of the land. They were to tear down their altars, drive them out. But he says here in Judges 2:2, but you have not obeyed me. You have not obeyed me. So here we have disobedience to the Lord. And he says, what is this that you have done? Therefore, I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they will become as thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. Again, think Deuteronomy 28, verses 15 through 68, the judgments here, the disobedience. So here we show where the people are going to weep. They're going to have a great emotional outpouring, but it's not going to affect any change. So the people weep and they offer sacrifices, hence the name Bokim, which means weepers. But the narrative quickly reveals that their repentance or change of mind was in fact superficial because it doesn't change anything. Then we have a recap of Joshua's death. It says in verse 6, when Joshua had dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went each to his inheritance to possess the land. This is a recap of when Joshua died. And we're told here that the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Then Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the territory of his inheritance of Timnath-Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gosh. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord. Now that's an important clause there, and that's why we have the reference to Joshua after his death and the elders, to now we have this generation who gathered together, who also were gathered to their fathers, and so they died. And then we have here the clause, and there arose another generation who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done in Israel. And so now we're going to have the turning to idolatry. So the chapter then provides a summary of the recurring cycle, where we're going to see this turning away. So the chapter then provides a summary of the recurring cycle that will dominate the rest of the book. We're going to see the cycle where Israel forsakes the Lord and serves the Baals, that is, idols. God responds in judgment, so the people turn to sin. God sends suffering, handing them over to their enemies. Israel then cries out in distress. There's their supplication. And God is going to raise up a Savior or judges, leaders who will deliver them. You see this in Judges 2:11. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. I laugh because it's so insane. It's just absolutely crazy. And it says in verse 12, and they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them. So they fall into the trap of getting caught up into the pagan culture. They wind up following other gods from among the peoples who were around them. And they bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. So they turn away from the Lord, they forsake the Lord. And it says in verse 13, so they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. Then we have God rendering judgment upon them. He's going to send suffering their way. This is divine discipline, because he whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. Verse 14, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of plunderers who plundered them. Again, think Deuteronomy 28 and the curses. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. So God sends judgment, suffering their way. Verse 15, wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, that is, for calamity. As the Lord had spoken and as the Lord had sworn to them, so they were severely distressed. And so they are distressed here. It says, then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. Now, of special note, and I've got this here in my notes, so let me switch over here briefly. Of special note in Judges is the repeated phrase, did evil. Now, the word evil translates the Hebrew word ra, which in many contexts refers to evil production born out of evil hearts. When the term is used of God, when it says that the Lord did evil to them, the word would better be translated calamity. Calamity. And a word has to have its meaning determined by the context, because context always determines the meaning of a word. And you'll find some translations that will translate it as calamity. I think that's a better rendering. But of special note in Judges is the repeated phrase, did evil, from the Hebrew ha-ra, ha being the definite article here, so it's specific, it's talking about the evil. And this consistently refers to the specific sin of idolatry, Israel's abandonment of the Lord to serve other gods. You see it in Judges 2:11, where it talks about the sons of Israel did evil. Judges 3:7, that the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherah. Verse 12, the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. Judges 4:1, then the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. Judges 6:1, then the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Judges 10:6, then the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Asheroth, the gods of Aaron, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the sons of Ammon, and the gods of the Philistines. Thus they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. Judges 13:1, now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So you see this repeated pattern that is going, that is starting here, but it is continuing. And so this is a breach of covenant loyalty that provoked divine judgment and initiated the recurring cycle of oppression and deliverance. And again, there I reference Deuteronomy 28, because again, if one understands Deuteronomy 28 and the promise of God being faithful to bless when they obey and to curse when they disobey, he's being faithful to his word. Now remember back early on in chapter 1, when God gave the directive for Judah to go up and to take the land, Judah responded positively, and Judah went in and took the land, and the Lord blessed them. The Lord gave them the victory. And there you see the ideal. There you see them being obedient to the Lord, walking by faith, obeying God's directives, and God blessing them. You see him being faithful to his word. But then you see the Israelites turning away, and they're not driving out. And then in Judges chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, the angel of the Lord comes and says, why are you disobeying me? You have disobeyed me. And so he then begins to pronounce judgment upon them for their disobedience. And then we have the people here in Judges 2:17. It says, and so even though God raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them, here's what's crazy. They're going to cry out for deliverance. God is going to raise up a savior, a judge, a shaphat. He's going to raise up, he's going to deliver them. But then the people are not going to listen to the judges. So they're going to say, well, thank you for delivering us. Now we're going to go back to our sinful ways. And so chapter 2, verse 17 really sets a pattern that you see not only in the book of Judges, but that you see throughout the Scriptures. It says, "Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they played the harlot after other gods and bowed themselves down to them. They turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do as their fathers." And again, that's why I made the comment earlier that the faith of one generation is the faith of one generation. And even though the second generation of Israelites that came out of Egypt were by and large obedient, Moses set the stage for that. They went in under the leadership of Joshua, and with a few exceptions, they were by and large faithful, obedient. Yet the generations that followed, it fell apart. I've got a little note here, and I'm chased down another rabbit trail here. And that is that Scripture records a long line of God-appointed leaders who were resisted or rejected by the nation of Israel, reinforcing the pattern seen in Judges 2:17. Moses himself faced repeated rebellion from Israel in the wilderness, from the golden calf incident to Korah's revolt. We talked about that. And my heart breaks when I read through Exodus and Numbers. Oh my, and how the people just rebelled against Moses. The cost of leadership is just absolutely tremendous. And, part of what made Moses such a great man was that he endured. Samuel also was rejected by the people when the people demanded a king to be like all the other nations, which the Lord interpreted ultimately as a rejection of his own rule. Elijah, the prophet, was also marginalized in a nation captivated by Baal worship. When you get to 1 Kings 18, you see where, again, Ahab, who was the king in Israel, begins to defy the prophets, that God raises up prophets over and over again. God repeatedly sends the prophets, and yet Israel repeatedly rejects, the majority reject his messengers. Ahab, when he saw Elijah, refers to him as the troubler of Israel. Ahab was the troubler. Elijah was the prophet of the Lord sent to provide a message of turning back to the Lord and a life of obedience. Micaiah was also despised for speaking the truth. The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, he referred to Micaiah as a man whom he hates. He says, "But I hate him." So there's this long-standing tradition of resistance. And the prophets as a whole experienced this same resistance. Isaiah was told in advance that his message would harden the hearts of many. God told Isaiah in Isaiah 6:9, he said, "Go and tell this people, keep on listening, but do not perceive. Keep on looking, but do not understand. Render the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull and their eyes dim. Otherwise they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and return and be healed." And of course he says, "Lord, how long?" And he answered, "Until cities are devastated and without inhabitant. Houses are without people and the land is utterly destroyed. For the Lord has removed men far away, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land." And so you have Isaiah here being told that his message would harden many. Jeremiah, the prophet, the passage I was talking about earlier, Jeremiah 7:25 and 26, where God says, "Since the day that your fathers came out of the land of Egypt until this day, I have sent you my servants, the prophets, daily rising early and sending them. Yet they did not listen to me or incline their ear, but stiffened their neck, and they did more evil than their fathers." In Jeremiah chapter 20, Jeremiah was prophesying. And we're told in verse 2 that Pashur had Jeremiah the prophet beaten and even had him put in stocks. So had him beaten and had him arrested. Jeremiah 25:3, Jeremiah talking to the leadership of Israel, he says, "From the 13th year of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, even to this day, these 23 years, the word of the Lord has come to me. And I have spoken to you again and again, but you have not listened." Now, what makes a judge successful is he's faithful to the thing to which the Lord calls him to do. He's faithful to the message that God calls him to deliver. This was true for the prophets as well, that they were faithful. And that's what marked them as successful. But even though we may represent the Lord and we may speak His truth in love and we may seek to communicate His truth to other people, again, we are responsible for output, not outcomes. And we are responsible to present the message of the Lord as clearly and as concisely as we can. But what happens when it falls on the heart of the person who hears it, who receives it, is out of our control. And there was this recognition here that Jeremiah had been faithful to speak the word of the Lord for 23 years. And can you imagine being a messenger and being called by the Lord to deliver His word to a recalcitrant people who are hard-hearted? And even though you are faithful for 23 years, and that Jeremiah had been faithful and spoken to them again and again, yet they had not listened. Ezekiel talks about, it says here in Ezekiel 2:3, "Then he said to me, Son of man, I am sending you to the sons of Israel, to a rebellious people who have rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me to this very day. I am sending you to them who are stubborn and obstinate people." And so think about being delivered to a message, to be a messenger like that. Now, there are high points in Israel's history. I certainly don't want to diminish that. We rejoice in those moments. We love Moses. We love Joshua. We love when the judges rise up and they're obedient to the Lord. We love David. We love Solomon when he's in the will of God, not at the end of his life. We say, ugh, what's going on with that? And we love these obedient to the word believers and these high points in Israel's history, really bright spots. But the majority of the record is that they repeatedly turn away from the Lord. And so even though God raises up these messengers, nonetheless the people refuse to pay attention. And that's what Zechariah 7:11 says, "But they refused to pay attention and turned a stubborn shoulder and stopped their ears from hearing." That makes me think of in Acts 7 when Stephen was delivering his beautiful message, his great message. And of course, it was his one and only message before he was killed and martyred. But the audience to whom he spoke, they began to shout and raise their voices so as to silence him. But it says that they covered their ears, that they literally put their hands on their ears so as to stop hearing his message while they rushed him to kill him. Again, you scratch your head at this. And of course, all of this ultimately anticipates the ultimate rejection of Jesus, the final and fullest revelation of God, whom the nation largely rejected despite His miracles, teaching, and compassion. John 1:11 tells us that He came to His own, and those who were His own did not receive Him. Now, we have the other side here, "But as many as received Him, to them He gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in His name." John 3:19 says that this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and that men have loved the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. And again, there's nothing wrong with the light here. This is the perfect Son of God. This is the incarnate Son of God. This is the eternal Son of God who is here in hypostatic union, who is undiminished deity combined together forever with perfect humanity. And yet, even though everything He says and everything He did could not have been more perfectly presented or accomplished, yet the majority of those who heard and saw Him rejected Him, turned away from Him, and ultimately were willing to have Him railroaded through a system, a corrupt system, and lie about Him to have Him crucified. And so again, that this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men loved the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. And John 12:37, "Though He performed so many signs among them, yet they were not believing." So the Old Testament thus establishes a consistent theme that when God sends leaders to call His people back to Himself, unbelief and negative volition often meet them. Yet God remains faithful to pursue, warn, and restore His people throughout history. And so again, we see this pattern that is set here that is really going to be indicative of the period of the Judges, where they did not listen to their judges. So the cycle of the Judges is about the erosion of covenant loyalty and the need for lasting godly leadership. It really sets the stage for the kings to come in. And you have David really serving as the standard, as the ideal king, because many of the leaders of Israel who followed, the kings of Israel who followed, were compared to David. Either they were a good king like their father David, or they did evil in the sight of the Lord and were not like their father David. And so David becomes a reference point that is mentioned throughout the kings. Verse 18 of Judges 2 tells us, when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. So the judges were called by the Lord. So when the Lord raised up judges for them, and again, this is the Lord's doing, we're told that the Lord was with the judge and delivered them, that is the Israelites, from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. And notice the reason: for the Lord was moved to pity. Thank God for His love, for His mercy, for His kindness, that He is slow to anger, that He is gracious, that He is compassionate. And even though Israel is in a state of disobedience, when they cry out to Him in their suffering, we're told that the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed and afflicted them. But, verse 19, it came about when the judge died that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers. So not only would they turn back to idolatry, but the pattern, the trend, as I mentioned before, this cycle is it's a downward cycle throughout. And so they would act more corruptly than their fathers in following other gods. That's the major sin, to serve them and to bow down to them. It's really demonism is what it is. And they did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways. So Judges chapter 2 verse 20 through chapter 3 verse 6 marks a theological interlude, explaining God's purpose in allowing the Canaanite nations to remain. The Lord declares that He will no longer drive them out completely because of Israel's disobedience. So the Lord says this: "So the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and He said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant," i.e. the Mosaic covenant. The transgression here talking about their disobedience and the curses that would follow, predicated on Deuteronomy 28, verses 15 through 68. "Because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not listened to my voice." Here He says, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died. Now again here you see the turning away from the majority of the nations. Again, Judges chapter 1, we see Judah being directed by the Lord, them responding in faith and God blessing them with victory. But then you have the disobedience where they're not driving out the Canaanites. Then they even turn to idolatry. So they begin to become influenced by the culture. And listen, we're not impervious, which is why it's so important that we have to be careful who our friends are, what we expose ourselves to culturally, because we can be drawn to those things. I mean, 1 John 2, 15 and 16 is very clear that we are told, do not love the world nor the things in the world. Things that pertain to the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the boastful pride of life. These are real dangers. And when the Christian is told, do not love the world, the word world there is not gay. It's not the Greek word gay that refers to the physical planet. It's cosmos. It's referring to Satan's world system, to cosmos diabolicus, to the philosophies and values that he promotes throughout this world system that he has created. Philosophies and values that are absolutely antithetical to the character and to the will of God. And it's communicated through television, through a lot of shows. It's communicated through news channels. It's communicated through the academic institutions. It's communicated through music. It's communicated through literature. It's communicated through art. It's communicated through many different platforms. Satan has many channels through which he promotes his philosophies and values. And so when we're told do not love the world, that command is given in 1 John 2 because it is an absolute possibility that we can fall victim to that. Listen, I know Christians who can be no different than the Israelites, people who are in a relationship with God, but if they are not careful, if they are not careful to know the will of God, if they are not careful to intentionally pursue the will of God, then they can fall victim to the things of this world. And I've seen it amongst people. In fact, I had a friend years ago when I was living in Lubbock back in the mid-90s. Me and him used to go to Bible study together. We were taking classes together at the university when I was doing my undergraduate degree. He would go with me down to the Lubbock County Jail. We would evangelize the inmates. We would share the gospel with them. He would come and sit in with me with Bible class. And we had these 2-hour Bible classes, 2-3 times a week. And I did that for 12 years and 4 months. And it was a tremendous opportunity that the Lord gave me. I had a federal prison ministry here for about 5 years, not far from my house. But my friend began to become friends with unbelievers and people who were steeped in human viewpoint and the values and philosophies of this world system. And he began to go out to nightclubs, and all of a sudden he was drinking more, and his marriage was on the rocks. And it was just a matter of time before all of a sudden he got caught up in drugs and got caught up in alcoholism. And the next thing I knew, he was committing crimes. He was burglarizing homes to pay for his cocaine addiction. And little by little, he's being influenced by these things. And he's inviting me to go out with him. And I'm like, dude, I can't go there. I came out of that lifestyle. I know what that is. That's a dead end, man. That is death with a capital D. I know what that is. I've been there, done that, got the battle wounds to show it. I still bear the marks of that. And yet he continued to expose himself to that, and I would repeatedly call him back. And I would say, don't do that, man. Come on, let's go over here to Denny's. Let's have coffee for a couple hours. Let's go study the Bible. And on occasion he would. And to the degree that I could be a godly influence to him, I was striving to be that. But then eventually it got to the point to where he just kept using and using and using, and eventually I found myself in a vulnerable spot, and I said, gotta cut it. Done with you. I'm not taking your calls. I'm not going to have anything to do with you. And it was just a matter of time before he made a wreck of his life. His marriage was destroyed. He had a 5-year-old son. I don't know what happened to him, but my friend wound up going to prison for several years because of drug charges and criminal charges and theft and burglary. And what's sad is he got out after a few years, and then from what I understand, he went right back to it and then wound up right back in prison again for round 2. Apparently he didn't learn his lesson the first time. Because you have to be very careful about who you call friend. You have to be very careful about the things that you expose yourselves to in this world, because there are evils out there. There are philosophies and values that are promoted out there that if you are not careful to guard your heart, then you can become damaged by these things. That's why Proverbs 4:23 says, above all things, guard your hearts, for from it flow the well springs of life. Guard your heart. Be mindful of what you take in. I own a TV, but rarely do I watch anything. I mean, I may watch a movie every couple months, it seems like these days, but I'm very careful about what I expose myself to, because garbage in, garbage out. I don't need that in my life. I want to function as a light to the Lord. I want to function as His representative in a fallen world. I take my Christianity very seriously. And that means that I've got to take the time to be in the Word and studying the Word, and devoted to sharing the Word with anybody that will listen, whether it's sharing the gospel or communicating biblical truth. And I have a responsibility to that. But there's a point where it's like, if you're going to function as a leader, if you're going to function as a maturing Christian in God's plan for your life and for history, then that means that you have to be very serious about these things. And I love the fact that you have these judges who are willing to rise up and who are willing to be obedient. But even though they are willing to do the will of the Lord, nonetheless, the people are not going to listen to them. They keep turning away from them. And here in this nation, we have eventually the anger of the Lord burned against Israel because this nation has transgressed my covenant. Judgment eventually comes, and this is true to life. And listen, God is a God of grace, and I'm all about grace, and I love grace, and God rescued me from the ash heap of my own ruin and a life of total destruction. And I have no doubt that I would be dead if God had not rescued me out of that. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind. But there's a point where it's like grace doesn't go forever. And there's a termination point. And this is true even in life. I mean, God's grace is infinite in scope, but it is not eternal in its duration. And there's a point even at death, that at death all of life's decisions are fixed. And grace comes to an end. And at that moment, what you've done with Christ in time and what you've done with your walk with the Lord ultimately plays out into eternity. And I know as a Christian, there will come a day, according to 2 Corinthians 5:10 and 1 Corinthians 3:10 through 15, that I will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. It is a judgment seat to evaluate my life. What did I do with my life? Did I serve the Lord? Did I produce gold and silver and precious stones? Or did I produce wood, hay, and straw? What did I do with my life? Now, I'll have heaven because that's a free gift, paid in full by the Lord Jesus Christ. But how I live determines those rewards at that judgment seat. But unbelievers who rejected Christ, they do not have heaven as their reward. And even though they may live to be 80, 90, 100, or even plus that, at death, all of life's decisions are fixed. And grace comes to an end at that moment. And what they do with Christ, what they did with Christ in time, determines their ultimate destiny. And those will stand before the great white throne judgment in Revelation 20, verses 11 through 15. And they will be judged with regard to what their place will be in the lake of fire. So grace is one of these things where God is gracious, but there's a point where there's a cutoff here. And we see this even in Israel, where he says, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not listened to my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died. And he says here, in order to test Israel by them. In other words, this becomes their testing ground. This becomes their trial period. In order to test them by them, whether they will keep the way of the Lord, to walk in it as their fathers did or not. Notice verse 23. So the Lord allowed those nations to remain, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. So these remaining nations will serve as a test to reveal whether Israel will walk in the ways of the Lord or follow surrounding pagan practices. Judges 3:1 says, now these are the nations which the Lord left to test Israel by them, that is, all who had not experienced any of the wars of Canaan, only in order that the generations of the sons of Israel might be taught. See, this has didactic purposes, so it's suffering not to destroy, but to train. It's designed to train them, in order that the generations of the sons of Israel might be taught war, so that those who had not experienced it formerly. And then he says, these are the nations, the 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites, who lived in Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon, as far as Lebo Hamath. And then he says in verse 4, these were for testing Israel. They were for testing Israel, to find out if they would obey the commandments of the Lord. And I think back to Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, where God talks about how he would test them, how he would try them. But again here it says that they were for testing Israel, to find out if they would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their fathers through Moses. So this divine testing is both disciplinary and revelatory. It exposes Israel's spiritual condition and calls them to renewed obedience. However, rather than resisting pagan influences, the Israelites intermarry with Canaanites and serve their gods. And I just want to scream and say, no, what are you doing? What are you doing? Verse 5, the sons of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and they took their daughters for themselves and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. Continued disobedience. disobedience, clearly violating God's command. Again, going back to Deuteronomy 7, verses 3 and 4, where God said, "You shall not intermarry with them." Directive of the Lord, "You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons. Why? For they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods." And think of even Solomon. Solomon, in all of his wisdom, by the end of his life, did evil in the sight of the Lord. 1 Kings 11, 1 through 10. You can read about that. And even Solomon fell victim to it because he married foreign women whom the Lord said, "Don't do that." And they did. Even someone as great as Solomon, his heart was turned away from the Lord, and by the end of his life, he too fell victim to this. But it was the product of his own choices. He exposed himself to that. And they corrupted his heart. And so even he turned away. But again, the commandment was that you will not intermarry, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. And yet we're told in Judges 3:6, that's exactly what they did. That they took their daughters for themselves and as wives and gave their own daughters to their sons and served the Lord. And we can say disobedience. This final indictment closes the prologue with a grim assessment that Israel has not only failed to conquer the land fully, sadly, they have begun to adopt the idolatry and immorality of the very nations that they were called to displace. And it so breaks my heart because they have everything that they need for a life of success. They have absolutely everything they need for a life of success. And they throw it away. It's through a life of disobedience. Theologically, Judges chapter 1 verses through 3:6 illustrates the dangers of spiritual compromise and the consequences of selective obedience. Israel's failure to obey God fully results not in peaceful coexistence, but in spiritual contamination. The Canaanites become thorns in their sides and snares to their souls. The pattern that emerges, forgetting God, embracing idols, experiencing divine discipline, underscores the need for constant vigilance and covenant faithfulness. The judges themselves will provide temporary deliverance, but no structural solution to Israel's heart problem. Let me say that again. The judges themselves will provide temporary deliverance, that is from external sufferings and pressures, but no structural solution to Israel's heart problem. These opening chapters foreshadow the need for a righteous king, one who will rule in wisdom and lead the people in obedience to God's law. Until then, Israel's existence in the land will be marked by instability, conflict, and the recurring need for divine intervention. But we're going to see this repeated theme. And I remember when I taught through Judges, again, years back, it's been probably about 9 or 10 years, and we went through Judges verse by verse, word by word, from chapter 1 all the way to the end. And there were so many times that my heart was just so grieved within at what was going on and the consequences, because it doesn't just affect the people who are committing sin, but it affects their children, it affects other people, it affects the lives of other people, and it's just so grievous to see. And I can't imagine what the Lord felt. I can't imagine how grieved he was at the evil that he saw among them. And you think of Judges 3:7, which is where we'll pick up next time, where he says the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asheroth. What's interesting is God's faithfulness to Israel goes back ultimately to that Abrahamic covenant. And the fact that Israel, even in rebellion, they are his chosen people. They are the apple of his eye. He loves them with an everlasting love, and they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. And Jesus, in Matthew 23, says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who stones the prophets and kills those who are sent to you. How often I wanted to gather you together like a hen gathers her chicks, but you were unwilling. But the heart of love and the tenderness of the language there speaks of a love that does not die. It cannot die. It is the love of God. And it is an eternal love for His people. And it continues even to this day. The love of God for His people Israel is still present and will be on into the future. There is a future for Israel. They are still His people, His chosen people, the apple of His eye, and who are beloved for the sake of the fathers. And yet, when we look through this context and we see their continued rebellion and resistance of Him, it's such a sad commentary. And yet, I can even look into today and I can see the failure of God's people today. I can see Christians so many times, both individuals and groups of people, who just turn away from the Lord and commit such evil things in this world, who wind up loving the world rather than obeying the directive in Scripture in 1 John 2:15 and 16 and other places. But again, you'll see this throughout. So I wrote here an excursus on idolatry. Again, I included these throughout my notes as they are doctrinally relevant to what we've studied. I would encourage you to read it just to kind of give you an understanding of these things. But I'm not going to cover it tonight since we're a little bit short on time. We've only got 2 weeks left of class, so next week when we gather back, I'm going to wrap it up here. So next week when we gather back, we'll look at Judges 3 through Judges 16, and then the week after that, we'll close out Judges in the book of Ruth. So we've got just 2 more weeks left after tonight, so we're very close to finishing up this semester's coursework. So let me go ahead and stop it there.